Dae-hyun felt the silence of the cafe more than he heard it. It was a different kind of quiet from the one he was accustomed to, a soft, clinking silence of ceramic on saucer, of whispered conversations, and the gentle hiss of the espresso machine. His silence was one of weighty decisions, of unspoken threats that hung heavy in airless rooms. Here, the air was filled with the scent of roasted coffee and cinnamon, a smell so aggressively normal it felt like an accusation. He checked his watch, a sterile, silver timepiece that measured his life in precise, profitable increments. 7:15. She was 15 minutes late. In his world, 15 minutes was an eternity, a window for betrayal, an opportunity for an enemy to strike. Here, it was likely just traffic. The thought was so foreign, so mundane, that it almost made him laugh. He had agreed to this absurdity for one reason: his uncle, a man whose quiet disappointment was more cutting than any blade. His uncle saw the corrosive loneliness that had settled deep in Dae-hyun's bones and, in his old-world wisdom, prescribed the only cure he knew: a good woman. The date had been arranged through a mutual acquaintance, a sanitized transaction of phone numbers, and a neutral meeting place. A blind date. The term itself felt ridiculous. Dae-hyun saw everything, always. He was never blind. He ran a hand over his perfectly tailored suit jacket, the fabric smooth and dark, an armor against a world he held at arm's length. He was ready to leave. Another 5 minutes, and he would consider his obligation fulfilled. He would call his uncle, report the failure, and return to the predictable solitude of his life, a life where every variable was controlled, every outcome calculated. The clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of other patrons faded into a dull hum, the soundtrack to his own isolation. Just as he made the decision to stand, a small voice cut through the noise, clear as a bell. A little girl, no older than 10, stood by his table. She was wearing a light pink dress that seemed to absorb and soften the cafe's dim lighting, making her a small beacon of warmth in the polished mahogany and cool leatherette. Her hair was braided in intricate patterns, and she clutched a worn, plush rabbit in one hand. She looked at him with wide, curious brown eyes, entirely unafraid. Dae-hyun froze. Children were not a part of his world. They were abstract concepts, symbols of a life he would never have, existing only in the periphery of his vision, in parks he drove past, in commercials on screens he ignored. This one, however, was very real and standing far too close. He scanned the room out of pure instinct, his mind cataloging exits, threats, and angles. But there was no threat here, only this small, impossible person looking up at him. He had no protocol for this. His mind, a finely tuned machine for risk assessment and strategy, went completely blank. She took another step forward, her small shoes scuffing softly on the wooden floor. She cleared her throat, a serious, formal little sound that was utterly comical. Dae-hyun remained perfectly still, a statue in a suit, his face an unreadable mask of calm that concealed a maelstrom of confusion. He had faced down men who would kill for a fraction of what he controlled, and he had never felt a single tremor of fear. Yet, the direct, guileless gaze of his child made the back of his neck prickle with an unfamiliar anxiety. She was a variable he could never have anticipated, a piece that didn't belong on his carefully arranged chessboard. Then she spoke, her voice soft but certain, delivering a line that would forever divide his life into a before and an after. "My mommy's sorry she's late." The words hung in the air between them. Dae-hyun stared at her, his mind struggling to process the statement. He replayed the sentence, dissecting it for hidden meanings, for traps, for deceit. But there was none. It was the simple, unvarnished truth, delivered with the absolute sincerity only a child possesses. He looked around again, expecting to see a woman, her mother, gesturing from across the room, using her daughter as a charming little envoy. But there was no one. Just the girl, the pink dress, and the plush rabbit. She seemed to take his silence as an invitation, pulling out the chair opposite him and clambering onto it. Her feet, clad in shiny black shoes, dangled a good foot from the floor. She placed her rabbit on the table, propping it up against the sugar dispenser with great care. "His name is Jedediah," she announced, patting the rabbit's head. "He's very old." Dae-hyun could only nod, a short, jerky movement. His throat felt dry. He was supposed to be meeting a woman named Ilara. This tiny person was apparently the advanced team. She had to help a man who fell off a ladder. The girl continued, her narrative flowing with an easy confidence he found both baffling and mesmerizing. He broke his arm in 2 places. It was very bendy in a way it's not supposed to be, she demonstrated with her own arm, making a face of mild disgust. A flicker of something, humor, perhaps, stirred in Daehyun's chest, a strange and unwelcome sensation. He was still calculating, still assessing. Was this a setup? A distraction? But the sheer, unadulterated innocence radiating from the child was a more formidable defense than any bodyguard. No one could fake this. No one could weaponize this level of guileless charm. He was completely disarmed. Just then, a woman rushed through the door of the cafe, her eyes scanning the room with a frantic energy. She was wearing a simple beige dress, and her face was a canvas of stress and apology. Her eyes landed on her daughter, sitting opposite a man who looked like he had been carved from granite, and for a terrifying second, her heart stopped. Ilara's breath caught in her chest as she hurried toward the table, a torrent of apologies already forming on her lips.
Zoe.
What are you doing? You were supposed to wait for me by the door. Her voice was a mixture of relief and stern admonishment. She looked from her daughter's unconcerned face to the man's impassive one. He was handsome in a severe, intimidating way, his dark hair perfectly styled, his suit looking more expensive than her car. His eyes, dark and watchful, held a stillness that was deeply unsettling. He looked less like a man on a blind date and more like a predator observing its prey. A wave of maternal fear washed over her. I am so sorry, she said, her words tumbling out in a rush as she reached the table. The ER was a disaster, and then my babysitter canceled last minute, and I told her to wait. I can't believe she just came over here. The man, Daehyun, simply raised a hand, a small, economical gesture that nonetheless commanded the chaos to cease. It's fine, he said. His voice was low and smooth, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. She was explaining about the man with the bendy arm. Zoe beamed. See, Mommy? He's not mad. I told you he had a nice face, just a little grumpy. Ilara felt a blush creep up her neck. Zoe, you don't say that to people. She turned back to Daehyun, her expression mortified. Again, I am so sorry. We can just go. I've already ruined this. She started to gather Zoe, but the little girl stubbornly held her ground, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. To Ilara's complete astonishment, Daehyun spoke again. Sit down, he said. It wasn't a command, not exactly, but it held a quiet authority that made her pause. Your daughter has already ordered for her rabbit. It would be rude to leave. He gestured toward Jedediah, who was still propped against the sugar, and for the first time, Ilara saw the corner of his mouth twitch, the barest hint of a smile. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. She sank into the chair beside Zoe, her purse clattering onto the table. The 3 of them sat in a profoundly awkward silence, a tableau of the world's most unlikely dinner party, the tired nurse, the stoic mystery man, and the 10-year-old diplomat in a pink dress. The waitress, a young woman with a kind smile, seemed unfazed by this strange scene. She appeared at their table, her notepad ready. Can I get you folks something to drink? Daehyun looked at Zoe, a silent question in his eyes. A hot chocolate, please, Zoe said immediately, her voice full of hope. With whipped cream. And sprinkles. Jedediah wants one too, but he's not allowed sugar after 6-inch. Ilara opened her mouth to object. It was too late for that much sugar. But Daehyun had already turned to the waitress. 2 hot chocolates, one with whipped cream and sprinkles, and a black coffee. He looked at Ilara. And for you? Flustered, she just nodded toward his coffee. The same is fine. As the waitress left, Daehyun leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing almost imperceptibly. He was watching her, but his gaze was no longer just assessing a threat. It was curious. You're a nurse? He asked. She nodded, feeling a familiar exhaustion settle over her. Emergency room. It's chaotic. I can imagine, he said, and she had the distinct impression that he truly could, though likely for very different reasons. The conversation haltingly moved forward, prodded along by Zoe's innocent, and often brutally direct, questions. "Why are you so quiet?" she asked him, head cocked to the side. Dae-hyun seemed to consider the question with the gravity of a corporate negotiation. "I prefer to listen," he said finally. "You learn more that way," Zoe nodded sagely. "My teacher says that too. She says I should try it sometime." Alara couldn't help but smile, a real, genuine smile that reached her tired eyes. She saw Dae-hyun notice it, his gaze lingering for a moment before flicking away. The drinks arrived, and Zoe's face lit up at the sight of the mountain of whipped cream. As she meticulously spooned the foam into her mouth, a fragile peace settled over the table. Dae-hyun learned that Alara had moved here 3 years ago for the job, that she loved to garden but never had the time, and that Zoe was the undisputed center of her universe. In turn, Alara learned almost nothing about him, except that he answered a child's questions with a surprising and gentle honesty. When Zoe asked him what his favorite animal was, he replied, "A wolf," without hesitation, because they understand the strength of the pack. The evening wore on, a surreal bubble of time that felt disconnected from the rest of Dae-hyun's life. He watched as Alara gently wiped a smudge of chocolate from Zoe's cheek, her movements efficient yet tender. He saw the deep grooves of fatigue around her eyes, but also the fierce, unwavering light within them. There was a resilience in her, a strength that wasn't forged in violence or fear, but in love and sacrifice. It was a kind of power he had never encountered before, and he found it unnervingly compelling. He had spent his entire adult life building walls, fortifying his emotions against a world that saw vulnerability as a fatal weakness. Yet this woman and her child had, in the space of an hour, walked straight through his defenses without even realizing they were there. Zoe, now buzzing with sugar, was recounting the entire plot of a movie she had recently seen, complete with character voices and dramatic sound effects. Dae-hyun found himself listening, actually listening, a small, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. He caught Alara's eye over Zoe's animated head, and she gave him a small, apologetic shrug, but her smile was soft and genuine. In that shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of the beautiful, chaotic absurdity of the moment. When the bill came, he placed his card down before she could even reach for her purse. The date, if it could be called that, was over. They stood outside the cafe, the cool night air a sudden shock after the warmth inside. The silence between them was different now, less awkward, more uncertain. "Well?" Alara began, pulling Zoe's jacket a little tighter around her. "Thank you for the hot chocolate. And for not running away screaming." He almost smiled again. It was not what I expected. It was the truest thing he had said all night. As they turned to leave, Zoe suddenly broke free from her mother's hand. She ran back to Dae-hyun and, before he could react, wrapped her small arms around his leg in a fierce hug. He froze, his entire body rigid with shock. "Bye, Mr. Grumpy Face," she said, her voice muffled against the fabric of his trousers. "You're not so grumpy after all," and then she was gone, skipping back to her mother's side. Dae-hyun stood alone on the pavement, the phantom warmth of the hug still clinging to his leg. Mr. Grumpy Face. He should have been insulted. Instead, he felt seen. In the days that followed, the memory of the evening at the cafe played on a loop in Dae-hyun's mind. The sterile white of his apartment felt colder. The silence of his car felt emptier. His life, once a model of disciplined order, now seemed stark and colorless. The world of spreadsheets, clandestine meetings, and veiled threats felt like a foreign country. He found himself thinking about the smudge of chocolate on Zoe's cheek, the weary kindness in Alara's eyes, the ridiculous gravity with which Zoe had introduced her stuffed rabbit. These were useless, sentimental details, the kind of emotional clutter he had long ago purged from his life. Yet they persisted, refusing to be dismissed. One afternoon, he was driving back from a meeting on the other side of town and took a detour, a conscious deviation from his rigidly mapped-out route. He told himself it was to avoid traffic, but he knew it was a lie. He found himself parked across the street from the city hospital, its sprawling brick facade both imposing and mundane. He watched as nurses in scrubs came and went, their faces etched with the fatigue he now recognized. He wondered if Alara was in there, moving through the chaos with that quiet, determined strength. He sat there for 20 minutes, the engine of his luxury car humming softly, a silent, solitary observer. He was a man who existed in the shadows, and they were people who lived so vividly in the light. The gulf between their worlds seemed impossibly wide. He was about to pull away, to dismiss the entire impulse as a moment of weakness, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. He opened it, his professional paranoia kicking in for a moment before he read the words. "Hi, it's Alara. From the cafe. I got your number from our mutual friend. Just wanted to say thanks again for being so kind to Zoe." She's still talking about Mr. Grumpy Face. His thumb hovered over the screen. His instinct was to ignore it, to cut the connection, to retreat back to the safety of his isolation. It was the smart move. The safe move. But then he thought of Zoe's unabashed hug and the genuine smile that had briefly transformed Alara's tired face. He typed a reply, his words as spare and controlled as always. "You're welcome. She is a memorable child." He hit send before he could change his mind, the simple act feeling more reckless than any business deal he had ever made. That single text exchange cracked open a door he thought was permanently sealed. Their communication continued, sporadic at first, then settling into a gentle, daily rhythm. They were simple messages, small windows into each other's lives. She would tell him about a funny thing a patient had said, or a triumph in her small container garden on her apartment balcony. He learned that Zoe had won second place in her school's spelling bee, misspelling the word conscientious. Dae-hyun found himself smiling at his phone, a sight so unusual it would have sent his subordinates into a panic. In return, he offered carefully curated pieces of his own life. He spoke of his uncle's persistent gardening advice, of a book he was reading on ancient military strategy. He never mentioned his real work, the true source of the wealth and power that surrounded him. It was a dark, complicated truth he couldn't imagine laying at her feet. He was building a fragile bridge to her world, and he feared his own reality would be too heavy, causing the entire structure to collapse. One Saturday, he found himself drawn to a park near her neighborhood. He had no reason to be there. It was miles from his own sterile, high-rise district. He parked under the shade of a large oak tree and simply watched. And then he saw them. Alara was pushing Zoe on a swing, her face relaxed and happy. Zoe was leaning her head back, laughing as she soared toward the sky, her pink dress from the cafe replaced by jeans and a bright yellow t-shirt. The scene was painfully idyllic, a perfect slice of the normal life he had always viewed from a distance. A profound, aching loneliness washed over him, sharper and more potent than ever before. It was one thing to be alone in his own world. It was another to see the world he was missing, laid out before him like a feast he could never taste. He could just drive away. It would be the sensible thing to do. Stay in his lane, protect them from the darkness that clung to him like a second skin. But he didn't. He watched as Zoe jumped off the swing and ran toward an ice cream truck that had just jingled its way to the curb. He saw Alara sigh, checking her wallet. And in that moment, Dae-hyun made a decision. He turned off the engine, opened the car door, and stepped out into the sunlight. His presence changed the atmosphere of the playground. A few mothers glanced over, their expressions shifting from relaxed to wary as they took in the tall, imposing man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit who seemed so utterly out of place. Alara saw him approaching, and her hand instinctively went to Zoe's shoulder, a subtle, protective gesture. But there was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, questioning surprise. Zoe, however, broke into a wide grin. "Mr. Grumpy Face," she yelled, her voice carrying across the park. She ran toward him, all caution thrown to the wind. "Did you come to play on the swings?" He stopped a few feet away from them, feeling more exposed and out of his depth than he had in years. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, the lie sounding thin even to his own ears. His eyes met Alara's. "I saw the ice cream truck." He gestured toward it, then looked at Zoe. "My treat." A short while later, they were sitting on a park bench, an unlikely trio against a cheerful backdrop of laughing children and green grass. Dae-hyun, stiff in his suit, held a rapidly melting vanilla cone. Alara had chosen strawberry, and Zoe was happily demolishing a chocolate cone with rainbow sprinkles. For a long time, they didn't speak, simply eating their ice cream in a comfortable, shared silence. It was Dae-hyun who finally broke it. "My uncle," he began, his voice quiet. He was the one who arranged the meeting. Alara looked at him, her expression soft and encouraging. He worries, Dae-hyun continued, finding the words surprisingly difficult. He thinks I'm alone. It was a confession, stripped of all its defenses. He wasn't just a man on a blind date. He was a nephew trying to appease a concerned relative. He was lonely. He hadn't said the word, but it hung in the air between them, as clear as if he had shouted it. Alara nodded slowly, a world of understanding in the simple gesture. It's hard, she said, her voice gentle. Doing everything on your own. Sometimes I feel like I'm treading water, just trying to keep Zoe's head and my own above the surface. In that moment, on that simple park bench, they were no longer a mystery man and a harried single mother. They were just two people, sharing a moment of unvarnished truth about the weight they carried. Their connection, forged in the fires of an awkward blind date and solidified over ice cream in a park, began to deepen. It was a slow, cautious process, like two celestial bodies gradually being drawn into each other's orbit. Dae-hyun found himself creating reasons to be in her world. One evening, she sent him a frustrated text about a leaky faucet that was driving her crazy. An hour later, he was at her door, a toolbox in hand. He had never fixed a faucet in his life, but he owned the building's maintenance company, and a single phone call had armed him with a 10-minute tutorial from the city's best plumber. As he worked under her sink, the unfamiliar domesticity of the act felt both strange and deeply satisfying. Zoe sat on the kitchen floor, offering a running commentary and handing him tools he didn't need. Alara watched from the doorway, a look of amused disbelief on her face. You know, she said, you are a man of many surprising skills. He just grunted from under the sink, but he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hot water pipe. The biggest step came a few weeks later. Zoe was in a school play, a chaotic production about the solar system. She was playing the part of Mars, the red planet, and had 3 lines she had been rehearsing for weeks. You should come, Alara had said, the invitation so casual it felt momentous. No pressure, of course, on the night of the play. Dae-hyun sat in the back row of the school auditorium, a dark suit in a sea of proud, casually dressed parents. He felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. But when Zoe walked onto the stage in a lumpy red costume, her face serious with concentration, he felt a surge of something he could only describe as pride. She delivered her lines perfectly, and when she took her bow, her eyes scanned the audience, found his, and lit up with a brilliant smile. He gave her a small, subtle nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt more profound than thunderous applause. Later that week, he came over after Alara had finished a grueling double shift. She was asleep on the sofa, still in her scrubs, the television murmuring softly. Zoe was already in bed. He stood in the quiet of her small, warm apartment, a space so different from his own minimalist penthouse. It was filled with life, drawings taped to the fridge, a stack of library books on the coffee table, a pair of Zoe's shoes kicked off by the door. Without a sound, he went into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and began to cook. He made a simple soup, the quiet chopping of vegetables a meditative rhythm. The aroma filled the small apartment, and eventually, Alara stirred, blinking awake. She saw him standing at her stove, and her eyes filled with a sleepy, confused gratitude. You don't have to do this, Dae-hyun, she whispered, her voice thick. Dae-hyun turned, a ladle in his hand, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. I know, he said. And in those 2 words, the truth of his transformation was laid bare. This was not an obligation or a transaction. It was a choice. He was choosing this. He was choosing them. A year can change everything. It can thaw a frozen heart. It can build a home where there was once only a shelter, and it can weave 3 disparate lives into a single, resilient tapestry. On a bright Sunday afternoon, Dae-hyun sat at a stone chess table in the same park where he had once watched them from afar. The sun warmed his back, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees overhead. Across from him, Zoe, now 11, stared at the chessboard with fierce concentration, her chin propped in her hands. She was wearing a blue dress this time, and her brow was furrowed in thought. You told me the horsey knight could only move in an L shape, she said, pointing a small finger at one of his pieces. That looks like a sneaky L. Dae-hyun felt the corner of his mouth lift into a familiar, easy smile. It's still an L, just a different direction. You have to see the whole board, not just the one piece in front of you. Alara watched them from a nearby bench, a novel resting unread in her lap. She looked rested. The deep lines of fatigue around her eyes softened into faint traces of past struggles. A look of profound, peaceful contentment settled on her features as she observed the man she had once been terrified of patiently explaining the intricate strategies of chess to her daughter. His world had not disappeared. Dae-hyun was still who he was, a man who moved with a quiet power and an innate authority that could be unsettling. But the harsh edges had been worn smooth by love, by laughter, by the simple, grounding act of being needed for something other than his strength or his money. He was learning to live in the light, to find comfort in the mundane, to see strength in vulnerability. He had delegated more, stepped back from the abyss, building a higher wall between his life with them and the life that had once defined him. It was a difficult, precarious balance, but one he walked every day without complaint. Zoe finally made her move, sliding her bishop across the board with a triumphant flourish. "Check," she announced, her grin wide and proud. Dae-hyun looked down at the board, then back at her, feigning a look of shocked surprise. Her laughter echoed through the park, a bright, beautiful sound that had become the new soundtrack to his life. He looked over at Alara, and she met his gaze, her smile saying everything that still sometimes went unsaid between them. He thought back to that night in the cafe, to the empty chair and the profound emptiness in his own soul. He had been a man encased in ice, observing the world through a thick pane of glass. Then, a little girl in a pink dress had walked up to that glass, placed her hand upon it, and refused to believe he was as cold as he seemed. She and her mother hadn't just filled an empty seat at a blind date. They had dismantled his fortress, not with a battering ram, but with a simple, unwavering invitation to come inside. They had shown him that the strongest pack wasn't one bound by fear or duty, but by the quiet, unshakable loyalty of the heart. He moved his king out of check, a simple, defensive maneuver. But in his heart, he knew he had already been captured, and it was the most profound victory of his life.